Be The Last Call, a 5-chapter story for YouTube. Chapter 1, The Silent Alarm. Subscribe for more incredible real-life stories. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune in the common room of Sunset Manor, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional beige that Margaret Chen had grown to despise over the past 18 months. At 73, she sat in her designated spot by the window, watching the October rain streak down the glass, while her arthritic fingers worked methodically through a crossword puzzle. 6 letters. Betrayal by family, she muttered to herself, pencil hovering over the grid. The sharp pain started as a whisper in her chest, a tightness she initially attributed to the anxiety that had become her constant companion since moving here. But as the minutes ticked by, the whisper grew into a shout, radiating down her left arm with an intensity that made her drop the puzzle book. "Nurse!" she called out weakly, but the common room was nearly empty except for Mr. Rodriguez dozing in his wheelchair and Mrs. Patterson staring blankly at the muted television showing afternoon soap operas. Margaret pressed the call button beside her chair, her breathing becoming shallow and labored. The familiar crushing sensation in her chest wasn't like the heartburn she'd dismissed for weeks. This was different, urgent, terrifying, and undeniably real. Nurse Kelly, a young woman with kind eyes but perpetually rushed movements, finally appeared 15 minutes later. "What's wrong, Mrs. Chen?" "My chest. I think I'm having a heart attack," Margaret gasped, clutching at her cardigan. Kelly's expression shifted from routine concern to genuine alarm as she took in Margaret's pale complexion and labored breathing. "I'm calling 911 right now. Just try to stay calm." As Kelly rushed away, Margaret's mind drifted to her daughter, Jessica. When was the last time they'd spoken? 2 weeks ago? 3? The conversations were always the same. Brief, obligatory check-ins, filled with Jessica's complaints about work, her husband's golf obsession, and her teenager's latest rebellion. The paramedics arrived with a controlled urgency that Margaret found both comforting and terrifying. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the common room's mirror, a small, frightened woman who looked every one of her 73 years. "We need to contact your family," one of the paramedics said as they wheeled her toward the ambulance. "My daughter, Jessica Chen Morrison," Margaret whispered, providing the number she knew by heart, despite rarely having reason to use it. The ambulance ride was a blur of medical equipment and concerned voices. Through the small window, Margaret watched the familiar neighborhoods of her youth pass by, the corner market where she'd bought penny candy as a child, the church where she'd married David 47 years ago, the park where she'd pushed Jessica on swings during those precious early years, when being a mother had felt like the most natural thing in the world. At Riverside General Hospital, the emergency room staff moved with practiced efficiency. Margaret found herself surrounded by beeping machines and gentle voices, asking about her pain level, her medications, her medical history. But through it all, she kept looking toward the door, waiting for Jessica to burst through with that mix of panic and relief that daughters were supposed to show when their mothers were in crisis. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a cardiologist in her 40s with salt and pepper hair and steady hands, confirmed what Margaret already knew. "You've had a mild heart attack, Mrs. Chen. We're going to keep you for observation and run some more tests, but you're stable now." "Has anyone called my daughter?" Dr. Martinez glanced at her chart. "The nursing home contacted her. She should be here soon." But Jessica didn't come soon. Hours passed, and Margaret lay in the sterile hospital bed, listening to the sounds of the ER. Urgent voices, rolling gurneys, the constant electronic symphony of life-saving equipment. She dozed fitfully, waking each time footsteps approached her curtained area, only to be disappointed when they passed by or belonged to medical staff. It was nearly midnight when Jessica finally appeared, her designer handbag clutched tightly and her perfectly styled blonde hair slightly disheveled from the late hour. "Mom, really?" were Jessica's first words, not "Are you okay?" or "I was so worried." Just "Really?" Margaret felt her heart sink in a way that had nothing to do with her medical condition. "Jessica, I had a heart attack. The nurse said it was mild. And honestly, Mom, you've been claiming something was wrong for months. Remember when you were convinced you had pneumonia and it was just allergies? Or when you thought you broke your wrist? and it was arthritis. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She stared at her daughter, this woman she had carried for 9 months, nursed through childhood illnesses, supported through college, celebrated at her wedding, and helped raise her own children, and saw a stranger. "I'm not being dramatic, Jessica. The doctors confirmed—" "I know what they confirmed," Jessica interrupted, glancing at her phone. "Look, I'm glad you're okay, but it's late, and I have the Brennan account presentation tomorrow morning. Can we talk about your situation this weekend?" After Jessica left with promises to check in tomorrow that Margaret knew would likely become a brief phone call if she was lucky, she lay in the darkness listening to the night sounds of the hospital. Somewhere down the hall, a family was gathered around another patient's bed, their worried whispers and gentle laughter creating a cocoon of love and support. Margaret had never felt more alone. She reached for her cell phone on the bedside table, scrolling through her limited contacts. There, between dentist and hair salon, was a number she hadn't called in over a year. Robert Henley, attorney. Robert had handled her and David's wills years ago, back when Jessica had been attentive and caring, when the idea of needing protection from her own daughter would have seemed absurd. Margaret's finger hovered over the contact. It was nearly 1 a.m., but Robert had always said to call if she ever needed anything, any time. As she listened to the phone ring, she realized that this moment, lying alone in a hospital bed after a heart attack, dismissed and minimized by her only child, was exactly the kind of anything he'd been talking about. Chapter 2. The Reckoning. The morning sun filtered through the hospital window, casting long shadows across Margaret's breakfast tray of lukewarm oatmeal and bitter coffee. She'd barely slept after calling Robert Henley at 1 a.m., but his immediate concern and promise to visit first thing had given her the first sense of hope she'd felt in months. Dr. Martinez appeared during morning rounds, clipboard in hand, and a gentle smile that reminded Margaret of her own daughter from decades past, when Jessica still looked at her with love instead of inconvenience. "Your tests look good, Mrs. Chen. The damage was minimal, but this was definitely a warning. We're going to adjust your medications and want to see you in cardiology next week." "Doctor," Margaret began hesitantly, "is it normal for stress to trigger these episodes?" Dr. Martinez pulled up a chair beside the bed, her expression growing more serious. "Absolutely. Emotional stress is a significant factor in heart disease, especially for women your age. Are you experiencing particular stresses at Sunset Manor?" Margaret found herself opening up to this kind stranger in ways she hadn't been able to with her own family. She talked about the loneliness, the feeling of being warehoused and forgotten, the way Jessica treated her concerns as nuisances rather than legitimate health issues. "Mrs. Chen, you mentioned feeling dismissed when you report symptoms. That's concerning, both medically and—" "Doctor." Martinez paused, choosing her words carefully. "From a care perspective, do you have someone advocating for you?" Before Margaret could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. "I hope I'm not intruding." Robert Henley stood in the doorway, his silver hair neatly combed, despite the early hour, carrying a small bouquet of chrysanthemums and wearing the same kind expression she remembered from their meetings years ago. "Robert!" Margaret's voice brightened considerably. Dr. Martinez stood to leave. "I'll check on you later, Mrs. Chen, and I meant what I said about having proper advocacy for your care." After she left, Robert pulled the chair closer to Margaret's bed. At 68, he was only 5 years younger than Margaret, but his sharp eyes and commanding presence made him seem decades more vital than she felt. "Margaret, you sounded frightened on the phone last night. Tell me everything." She found herself recounting not just the previous evening, but months of accumulated grievances. The way Jessica had steamrolled her into Sunset Manor, promising it was just temporary after David's death. The dismissive attitude toward her health concerns. The brief, obligatory visits that felt more like items being checked off a to-do list. "I used to think I was being too sensitive," Margaret concluded, "but lying here last night I realized something. If Jessica can dismiss a heart attack as drama, what happens when something more serious occurs?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, his legal mind clearly working through implications. Margaret, I have to ask some difficult questions. Do you feel your current living situation is in your best interest? Honestly, no. I miss my independence. I miss cooking my own meals, deciding when to watch television, having conversations about something other than medications and bingo schedules. And financially, I'm comfortable. The house sale, David's pension, our savings. I could afford in-home care or a nice independent living community. Jessica insisted Sunset Manor was the practical choice, but I think it was just the most convenient choice for her. Robert nodded thoughtfully. What would you like to see happen? Margaret looked out the window at the busy street below, watching people hurry to work, to appointments, to lives that mattered to someone. I want to live somewhere that feels like home again. I want my health concerns taken seriously, and I want my daughter to understand that I'm not a burden to be managed. I'm her mother, and I deserve better. Margaret, I'm going to be direct. Based on what you've told me, there might be grounds for discussing your care arrangement more formally. You're competent, you have means, and you have rights. But this could create family tension. Robert, I had a heart attack last night, and my daughter's first concern was her work presentation. How much more tense can things get? They were interrupted by Jessica's arrival, her power suit and clicking heels announcing her presence before she appeared. She stopped short when she saw Robert, her perfectly plucked eyebrows drawing together in confusion. Mom, who is this? Jessica, you remember Robert Henley? He handled the legal work when Dad and I updated our wills. Jessica's expression shifted from confusion to suspicion. What's he doing here? Robert stood, extending his hand with professional courtesy. Ms. Morrison, your mother called me last night. She was concerned about some legal matters. Legal matters? Jessica's voice rose slightly. Mom, what legal matters? Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her, the kind of peace that comes from finally standing up for yourself after years of being pushed around. Jessica, I've been thinking about my living situation and my care. Your care is fine. Sunset Manor is one of the best facilities in the area. It may be one of the best facilities, but it's not what I want. Jessica turned to Robert, her corporate negotiator instincts kicking in. Mr. Henley, I don't know what my mother has told you, but she's been confused lately, emotional since Dad died. She's not thinking clearly. Robert's expression didn't change, but his voice carried the authority of 4 decades practicing law. Ms. Morrison, your mother seems quite lucid to me, and she has every right to make decisions about her own care. She had a heart attack. She clearly can't live independently. Actually, Doctor, Martinez said, reappearing in the doorway, your mother's heart attack was mild, and with proper medication management, there's no medical reason she couldn't live independently with appropriate support services. Jessica looked between the 3 of them, her mother, the lawyer, and the doctor, and Margaret could see her realizing that the conversation had moved beyond her control. Mum, you're being impulsive. Let's talk about this when you're feeling better. I am feeling better, Margaret said quietly. Better than I have in months. Robert, I'd like to discuss my options for alternative living arrangements, and I'd like to review my advance directives to ensure my healthcare wishes are being properly communicated. The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Jessica's phone buzzed and she glanced at it reflexively, a gesture that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Your presentation? Margaret asked sadly. Jessica had the grace to look embarrassed. Mom, go to your presentation, Jessica. Robert and I have some planning to do. After Jessica left, promising to continue this conversation later, in a tone that suggested she viewed it as a negotiation to be won rather than a discussion to be had, Margaret turned back to Robert. What are my real options? Robert smiled for the first time that morning. More than you might think, Margaret, and we're going to explore every single one of them. Tune. Chapter 3, The Investigation. Hit subscribe if you want to see justice served. 3 days later, Margaret sat in Robert's downtown law office, feeling more alert and purposeful than she had in months. The familiar smell of leather-bound books and coffee created an atmosphere of serious business, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic helplessness of Sunset Manor. Robert's assistant Eleanor, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, had prepared a comprehensive folder of documents and research. Margaret was impressed by the thoroughness. It reminded her of her own attention to detail during her 30 years as a high school English teacher. I've been busy since our hospital conversation, Robert began, opening the thick folder. "First, let me show you what I've found about your current situation." He spread several documents across the mahogany conference table. Margaret recognized some of them. The Sunset Manor admission papers she'd signed in a grief-stricken haze 6 months after David's funeral, when Jessica had insisted she couldn't live alone anymore. "Margaret, do you remember signing these papers that designated Jessica as your healthcare proxy?" She nodded, remembering that difficult day. "Jessica said it was just a precaution, in case something happened during a procedure or if I was unconscious." "That's typically how these are used," Robert agreed, "but Jessica has been interpreting this quite broadly. According to the staff at Sunset Manor, she's been making decisions about your daily care, your activities, even your social interactions." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office's air conditioning. "What do you mean?" Elena leaned forward, consulting her notes. "I spoke with several staff members at Sunset Manor. They mentioned that your daughter has given specific instructions about limiting your phone calls after 8 p.m., has restricted certain visitors, and has asked to be notified about any complaints you make about your care. She told them I was prone to exaggeration," Margaret said quietly, pieces of a disturbing puzzle clicking into place. "There's more," Robert continued gently. "I also had a conversation with Dr. Peterson, your physician at Sunset Manor. He mentioned that Jessica specifically requested he not encourage your concerns about chest pains, saying you had a tendency toward hypochondria." Margaret's hand went instinctively to her chest, where the very real pain of her heart attack still created occasional twinges. "But I wasn't imagining it. I had a heart attack." "Exactly, which raises serious questions about how your health concerns have been handled, or rather, dismissed." Elena pulled out another set of documents. "We've also reviewed your financial situation. Margaret, you have substantial assets. The sale of your home, your husband's pension, your savings. You could easily afford premium independent living or in-home care. There was no financial necessity for choosing Sunset Manor." Robert leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "Margaret, I need to ask directly. Do you believe Jessica made decisions about your care based on what was convenient for her, rather than what was best for you?" Margaret stared out the office window at the busy street below, watching people move with purpose and autonomy she'd forgotten she could have. I think Jessica saw me as a problem to be solved, rather than a person to be cared for." "That's a significant distinction," Robert noted, "and it has legal implications." Elena opened another folder. "We've researched several alternatives for you. There's Riverside Independent Living. It's more expensive than Sunset Manor, but it offers apartments, not rooms, and you'd have your own kitchen, your own schedule, and healthcare support available when needed." She showed Margaret glossy brochures featuring smiling seniors in bright, airy spaces that looked nothing like the institutional corridors of Sunset Manor. "There's also Oakwood Assisted Living, which offers more healthcare support but still maintains individual autonomy, and we found several agencies that provide in-home care if you wanted to rent a small apartment independently." Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months: excitement about the future. These all look wonderful. But what about Jessica? She's not going to just accept this. Robert and Elena exchanged glances. "That's the complicated part," Robert admitted. "Jessica could challenge your decision-making capacity. She could claim you're not competent to make these choices. But I am competent. I know you are. Dr. Martinez confirmed it, and I've had you evaluated by a geriatric psychiatrist who agrees completely. But family disputes over elder care can get messy, especially when significant assets are involved." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean, assets are involved?" Elena consulted her notes again. "Margaret, when you moved to Sunset Manor, Jessica was designated as your power of attorney for finances as well as health care. She's been managing your investments, paying your bills, handling your assets. I thought that was just temporary, while I was getting settled." "It may have started that way," Robert said carefully, "but she's been quite active in managing your money. She's moved significant funds into accounts where she's the joint holder." Margaret felt the room tilt slightly. "Joint holder? Meaning she has equal access to those funds. Now, I'm not suggesting anything improper. Adult children often help manage their parents' finances, but combined with the restrictions on your daily life, and the dismissal of your health concerns. It creates a pattern that's concerning. The afternoon sun slanted through the office windows, casting long shadows across the documents spread before Margaret. She thought about Jessica's recent purchase of a new BMW, the expensive vacation to Europe she'd mentioned, the kitchen renovation that had seemed unusually lavish for someone who always complained about money. What are my options? Robert straightened, shifting into what Elena privately called his battle mode. Several options. First, we can revoke the power of attorney designations and establish new healthcare directives that better reflect your wishes. Second, we can work with one of these alternative living arrangements to get you moved somewhere you'll be happier. Third, we can request a full accounting of how your finances have been handled. And if Jessica fights this, then we fight back. Margaret, you have rights. You're competent, you have resources, and you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. If your own daughter won't provide that, the legal system will ensure she can't prevent you from finding it elsewhere. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the woman she used to be, the teacher who had advocated for difficult students, the wife who had stood beside David through his cancer treatment, the mother who had sacrificed her own career advancement to be present for Jessica's childhood needs. I want to do this, she said finally. All of it. I want to move somewhere I can be happy. I want control of my own healthcare decisions. And I want to know exactly what Jessica has done with my money. Robert smiled, and Margaret caught a glimpse of why he'd been so successful as an attorney for 4 decades. Then let's get started. Elena, call Dr. Martinez and get copies of all of Margaret's medical records. I want documentation that she's competent and that her health concerns were legitimate. Then call Riverside Independent Living and schedule a tour for tomorrow. What about Jessica? Margaret asked. We'll handle Jessica, Robert said firmly. But first, we're going to get you somewhere safe and happy. Everything else can be addressed from there. As Elena began making calls and Robert started drafting legal documents, Margaret felt a sensation she'd almost forgotten: hope. For the first time in 18 months, she wasn't just surviving, she was planning a future. Dhaka. Chapter 4. The Confrontation. Margaret stood in the bright, airy apartment at Riverside Independent Living, sunlight streaming through windows that actually opened, a small luxury she hadn't realized she'd missed until now. The one-bedroom unit had a full kitchen, a comfortable living area, and most importantly, a sense of dignity that had been absent from her life for too long. The move-in process usually takes about a week, explained Sandra Willis, the community director, a woman in her 50s with grey-streaked hair and the kind of genuine warmth that came from actually caring about the residents rather than just managing them. We'll coordinate with the medical staff to ensure all your prescriptions are transferred, and you can choose your own primary care physician from our approved list. Choose my own physician, Margaret repeated, savouring the words. I'd forgotten that was an option. Elena, who had accompanied Margaret on the tour, was taking notes on her tablet. We'll need to arrange the moving service and coordinate with Sunset Manor for the transition. What would you like to do about informing Jessica? Margaret had been dreading this moment for 3 days. I suppose I should tell her myself, before she hears it from the nursing home. They were interrupted by Margaret's cell phone ringing. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, and Margaret felt her heart rate increase, though she was becoming better at distinguishing anxiety from cardiac symptoms. Hi, Jessica. Mum, we need to talk. I just got a very strange call from your lawyer asking for financial records. What's going on? Margaret looked out the window at the community garden where several residents were tending to late-season vegetables. I'm making some changes, Jessica, to my living situation and my care arrangements. Changes? Mom, you can't make major changes without discussing them with me. The assumption in that statement that Margaret needed permission for decisions about her own life crystallized everything that had gone wrong between them. Actually, Jessica, I can, and I am. I'm moving to Riverside Independent Living next week. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that Margaret wondered if the call had been disconnected. You're what? I'm moving to an independent living community. I've seen the apartment and I love it. I'll have my own kitchen, my own space and healthcare support when I need it. Mum, this is insane. You had a heart attack. You can't live independently. Sandra, overhearing the conversation, gently took the phone. Ms. Morrison, this is Sandra Willis from Riverside Independent Living. I wanted to assure you that we're fully equipped to support residents with cardiac conditions. Your mother would have 24-hour medical monitoring available, but she'd maintain her independence and autonomy. Margaret could hear Jessica's voice rising, though she couldn't make out the words. Sandra listened patiently, then handed the phone back. Mom, I'm coming over there right now. Don't sign anything. Jessica, I've already signed the lease agreement. This is happening. We'll see about that. The line went dead, and Margaret stared at her phone for a moment before looking up at Eleanor and Sandra. She's coming here, Margaret said. Eleanor nodded grimly. I thought she might. That's why Robert is meeting us here in 20 minutes. Sandra looked between them with concern. Is there going to be a problem? Possibly, Eleanor admitted. Margaret's daughter has been controlling about her care decisions. We're prepared for some resistance. 20 minutes later, Margaret was seated in Sandra's office when Jessica burst through the front doors of Riverside Independent Living like a force of nature. She looked around the elegant lobby with its comfortable seating areas and fresh flowers with obvious disdain. Where is she? Robert appeared in the lobby at the same moment, having arrived through a side entrance. Margaret had never been so grateful to see anyone in her life. Ms. Morrison, Robert said calmly, I'm glad you could join us. We have some matters to discuss. Jessica whirled around, her designer suit and perfectly styled hair looking out of place in the relaxed atmosphere of the senior community. Mr. Henley, I don't know what kind of scam you're running here, but my mother is not competent to make these kinds of decisions. Actually, she is, Robert replied, producing a thick folder. I have medical and psychological evaluations confirming your mother's complete competency. Dr. Martinez from the hospital, Dr. Stevens, a geriatric psychiatrist, and your mother's own physician have all confirmed that she's fully capable of making her own care decisions. Sandra gestured toward the conference room. Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. Once they were seated around the polished conference table, Jessica immediately went on the offensive. Mom, you're being manipulated. This place costs twice as much as Sunset Manor. You can't afford it. Actually, she can, Robert interjected, pulling out financial documents. Margaret has substantial assets, more than enough to afford this community for many years. Jessica's face flushed. Those assets need to be preserved for her long-term care for emergencies. Jessica, Margaret said quietly, I'd like to understand something. Robert has been reviewing my financial records, and it appears that significant amounts of money have been moved into joint accounts where you have access. That's for your protection, Mum, in case something happens to you. What exactly did you think might happen to me? Elena opened her laptop and turned it so everyone could see the screen. Ms. Morrison, over the past 18 months, there have been numerous large withdrawals from your mother's accounts. A $45,000 withdrawal in June, another $32,000 in August. The memo lines indicate emergency expenses and care costs, but we can't find corresponding expenses at Sunset Manor. Jessica's composure cracked slightly. There have been extra costs, medical expenses, improvements to her care. What improvements? Margaret asked. I've been asking for months to see a cardiologist about my chest pains, and you told the staff I was being dramatic. Because you were. You're always worried about something. The crying wolf syndrome. That's why when you actually had your little heart episode, nobody took it seriously at first. The words hung in the air like a confession. Robert leaned forward, his voice taking on the courtroom tone that had intimidated opposing counsel for decades. Ms. Morrison, did you just admit that you instructed medical staff to dismiss your mother's cardiac symptoms? That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant, Margaret said, finding her voice and her strength. Jessica, I almost died because you convinced everyone I was a hypochondriac. Do you understand that? Jessica looked around the room, seeming to realize for the first time that she was outnumbered and that her usual tactics weren't working. Mom, I've been trying to protect you, manage your care, preserve your resources. While accessing those resources yourself? That money was for your benefit. Robert opened another file. Ms. Morrison, we've traced several of the withdrawals. The $45,000 in June coincides with your kitchen renovation. The $32,000 in August matches your vacation expenses to Europe. There are several other suspicious transfers that correspond with your personal expenditures. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at her daughter, seeing clearly for the first time the woman Jessica had become, or perhaps had always been. "You've been stealing from me." "I have not been stealing." Jessica's voice rose to nearly a shout. "I've been managing your resources responsibly while dealing with an increasingly difficult and demanding mother who—" "Stop." Margaret's voice was quiet but firm. "Just stop." She turned to Robert. "I want her removed from all my accounts immediately. I want new healthcare directives drawn up, and I want to know exactly how much money she's taken." "Mom, you're making a terrible mistake." "No, Jessica, the terrible mistake was trusting you with my life and my money. The mistake was believing that you cared more about my well-being than your own convenience." Jessica gathered her purse, her face a mask of wounded anger. "Fine, make your mistakes, but don't come crying to me when this all falls apart." "I won't," Margaret said sadly. "I won't come to you for anything ever again." After Jessica left, slamming the door behind her, Margaret sat in the quiet conference room feeling drained but oddly liberated. "Are you all right?" Sandra asked gently. Margaret considered the question. Her daughter had been stealing from her, manipulating her care, and dismissing her health concerns. She was 73 years old and starting over in many ways. "You know what?" she said finally. "I think I'm going to be better than all right. I think I'm going to be happy." Robert smiled and began organizing his papers. "Now that's what I call a successful outcome." Chapter 5. The New Beginning. 6 months later, Margaret stood in her kitchen at Riverside Independent Living, humming while she prepared fresh coffee for her Tuesday morning book club. The morning sun streamed through her windows, illuminating the small herb garden she'd started on her balcony and the framed photos of her life with David that she'd finally felt ready to display again. The transformation in her life had been remarkable, but gradual. The first month had been challenging, learning new routines, making new friends, and adjusting to the freedom of making her own decisions after 18 months of institutionalized dependence. But each day had brought small victories, choosing what to eat for breakfast, deciding when to go to bed, having conversations about books and current events rather than medications and meal schedules. Her health had improved dramatically under the care of Dr. Janet Ross, a cardiologist who actually listened to Margaret's concerns and had adjusted her medications to better manage her heart condition. The anxiety-induced symptoms that had plagued her at Sunset Manor had virtually disappeared once she regained control over her environment and her care. A knock at her door interrupted her morning preparations. Margaret opened it to find Helen Nakamura, her neighbor from apartment 4B, holding a plate of homemade muffins. "Good morning, Margaret. I made way too many blueberry muffins again. Thought you might like some for your book club." Helen was 78, a retired professor of literature who had become Margaret's closest friend in the community. Their friendship had developed naturally over shared interests and mutual respect, a sharp contrast to the relationships Margaret had been expected to maintain at Sunset Manor, where activities were scheduled and social interactions felt forced. "Helen, you're an angel. Come in and have coffee before the others arrive." They settled in Margaret's bright living room, which she'd furnished with pieces from her old home that Jessica had insisted weren't suitable for nursing home living. The familiar furniture and decorations had helped make the apartment feel like home, rather than just another institutional placement. "How are you feeling about today?" Helen asked gently. Margaret smiled, understanding the reference. Today marked 6 months since she'd moved to Riverside Independent Living, and it was also the day she'd agreed to have lunch with Jessica, their first meeting since the confrontation at Sandra's office. "Nervous but ready," Margaret admitted. "Robert thinks it's important to keep the door open for reconciliation, and honestly, I miss my daughter. I miss the person she used to be anyway." Helen nodded knowingly. She'd heard the whole story during their many evening conversations over tea and had offered the kind of wisdom that came from 7 decades of life experience. "People can change, Margaret. Sometimes they need to lose something important before they understand its value." The book club members began arriving. Tom Bradley, a retired engineer with a passion for mystery novels. Sarah Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, a former nurse who brought a practical perspective to every discussion. And Marcus Williams, a retired teacher who reminded Margaret why she'd loved her profession so much. They were discussing their current selection, Louise Erdrich's The Round House, when Margaret found herself thinking about themes of justice, family loyalty, and the complex ways that love and harm could coexist within families. "Margaret, you seem distracted today," Sarah observed kindly. "Everything all right?" Margaret had learned that this group was safe, that she could be honest about her struggles without judgment or unwanted advice. "I'm having lunch with my daughter today. Our first meeting since everything happened." Tom, who had his own complicated relationship with adult children, nodded sympathetically. "That's brave of you. How are you feeling about it?" "Hopeful, but guarded," Margaret replied honestly. "I've realized that I can love Jessica while also protecting myself from her. That's something I never understood before, that love doesn't mean accepting harmful treatment." The group spent a few more minutes discussing family dynamics with the kind of openness that came from shared life experience and mutual support, then returned to their literary discussion. Margaret found herself grateful for these friendships that had developed organically, based on common interests and genuine affection, rather than proximity and convenience. After the book club ended and Margaret had cleaned up, she dressed carefully for her lunch with Jessica. She'd chosen a restaurant halfway between Riverside and Jessica's office, neutral ground, where neither of them would feel they had the advantage. Jessica was already seated when Margaret arrived, looking polished but subdued in a way that was unusual for her. She stood as Margaret approached, and for a moment they looked at each other across the months of hurt and anger. "Mum, you look good, really good." Margaret did look good. The constant stress and anxiety of her situation at Sunset Manor had taken a physical toll that she hadn't fully recognized until it was gone. She'd gained back some of the weight she'd lost, her color was better, and most importantly, she carried herself with the confidence that came from taking control of her own life. "Thank you. I feel good." They ordered their meals with the careful politeness of former intimates trying to navigate new boundaries. Jessica seemed uncertain, lacking the commanding presence she'd displayed during their last encounter. "Mum, I want to apologize." Margaret had prepared for many possible conversations, but a direct apology wasn't one of them. "Go on. I've been thinking about everything that happened, and I realize that I lost sight of what was important. I got so caught up in trying to manage your situation that I forgot you weren't a situation to be managed. You're my mother." Margaret waited, having learned the importance of letting people finish their thoughts before responding. "I also need to acknowledge that I made financial decisions that were wrong. I convinced myself I was protecting your assets, but I was really just taking advantage. I've spoken with Robert and I want to pay back every penny I took from your accounts." Margaret studied her daughter's face, looking for signs of the manipulation she'd become so familiar with. Instead, she saw something she hadn't seen in years: genuine remorse. "What changed?" Margaret asked simply. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, staring at her untouched salad. "My boss, actually. Karen Martinez. You remember her from the Christmas party a few years ago. She found out what happened, and she was horrified. She told me that what I'd done wasn't just wrong, it was elder abuse. And when she said those words, I realized that's exactly what it was." She looked up at Margaret with tears in her eyes. "Mom, I abused you. I took your money. I controlled your medical care. I dismissed your concerns, and I convinced myself I was doing it for your own good, but I was really doing it for my own convenience." Margaret felt her own eyes filling with tears, not from sadness but from relief at finally hearing the acknowledgement she'd needed. "And then Karen asked me something that I couldn't get out of my head. She said, 'How would you feel if your daughter treated you that way?' And I realized that Emma is watching how I treat you, and she's learning what it means to care for aging parents." Margaret thought about her granddaughter Emma, now 16 and full of the kind of confidence and idealism that reminded Margaret of her younger self. The idea that Emma might model her future caregiving on Jessica's example was sobering. "What do you want from this lunch, Jessica?" "I want to earn back your trust. I know that's going to take time, and I know I don't deserve it, but I want to try. I want to be the daughter you deserved all along." Margaret considered her response carefully. She'd spent months learning to distinguish between hope and wishful thinking, between healthy optimism and dangerous naivety. "Jessica, I appreciate your apology, and I'm glad you're taking responsibility for what happened. But trust is rebuilt through actions, not words. What are you actually willing to do differently? I've started seeing a therapist who specializes in family dynamics and caregiving stress. I want to understand how I got so far off track. I've also joined a support group for adult children of aging parents." Margaret was surprised. Jessica had always been skeptical of therapy and support groups, viewing them as signs of weakness rather than tools for growth. "I've realized that I was so afraid of losing you the way we lost Dad that I tried to control everything, including you. But control isn't care, and management isn't love." Their conversation continued for over an hour, covering topics they'd never discussed honestly. Jessica's fear of aging and death, Margaret's feelings of abandonment after David died, the way grief had affected both of their judgment, and the financial stress Jessica had been under that she'd never admitted. "I don't expect forgiveness right away," Jessica said as they prepared to leave, "but I hope that over time we can build something better than what we had before." Margaret hugged her daughter, really hugged her, for the first time in years. "I'd like that too, but we're going to do it slowly, and we're going to do it honestly." Over the following months, Jessica proved her commitment to change through consistent actions. She attended Margaret's medical appointments when invited, but as support rather than as decision-maker. She visited Riverside regularly, getting to know Margaret's friends and showing genuine interest in her mother's new life. Most importantly, she brought Emma to visit frequently, allowing Margaret to develop the kind of relationship with her granddaughter that had been impossible when Jessica controlled all access. The financial restitution took time, but Jessica made regular payments until every penny was returned to Margaret's accounts. More meaningfully, she helped Margaret establish a trust that would protect her assets while ensuring she maintained complete control over her own care decisions. On a warm spring afternoon, nearly a year after Margaret's heart attack, 3 generations of women sat in Margaret's apartment at Riverside Independent Living. Margaret was teaching Emma to make David's famous chocolate chip cookies, while Jessica watched with the kind of peaceful attention that had replaced her former frantic management style. "Grandma, tell me about when you and Grandpa first met," Emma said, measuring flour with the careful precision of someone learning an important skill. Margaret smiled, launching into the familiar story of meeting David at a library where she was studying for her teaching certification and he was researching an engineering project. As she talked, she noticed Jessica listening with genuine interest, as if hearing the story for the first time. Later, after Emma and Jessica had left, Margaret sat on her balcony watching the sunset and thinking about the past year. The heart attack that had seemed like such a catastrophe had actually been a gift, a wake-up call that forced her to reclaim her life and her dignity. Her phone rang, and Robert Henley's name appeared on the screen. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me calling so late. I just wanted to check in on how things went with Jessica today." "It went well, Robert. Really well. I think we're going to be all right." "I'm glad to hear that. You know, in 40 years of practicing law, I've seen a lot of family disputes, and I have to say, your situation has been one of the most satisfying resolutions I've witnessed." Margaret laughed. Satisfying? It was pretty messy for a while there, but that's exactly why it's satisfying. You didn't just solve the immediate problem, you transformed your entire life. You took control of your health, your finances, your living situation, and ultimately, your relationship with your daughter. That takes courage. After they hung up, Margaret remained on her balcony, listening to the sounds of the community around her, people talking on their balconies, someone playing piano in a nearby apartment, the gentle hum of lives being lived with purpose and dignity. She thought about the woman she'd been 18 months ago, frightened, isolated, diminished by circumstances and other people's decisions. Then she thought about the woman she was now, confident, socially connected, in control of her own destiny. The heart attack had been real, serious and frightening, but Jessica's dismissive response, "she's always dramatic," had been the real catalyst for change. In trying to minimize minimize her mother's medical emergency, Jessica had revealed the depth of her disregard for Margaret's well-being. And in that moment of clarity, Margaret had found the strength to call Robert and begin the process of reclaiming her life. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Margaret made a mental note to call Dr. Martinez tomorrow to schedule her 6-month cardiac checkup. Her heart was strong now, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. She had work to do, friends to see, books to read, and a granddaughter to spoil. Most importantly, she had a future that belonged entirely to her. The phone call to the lawyer had indeed been the right choice. It had led not just to legal protection, but to a complete transformation. From victim to advocate, from dependent to independent, from forgotten to celebrated. Margaret Chen had gotten her life back, and she intended to live every moment of it on her own terms. The end. If Margaret's story touched your heart, please subscribe to honor her courage and help others find the strength to stand up for themselves. You never know who might need to hear this message today. Author's note: this story explores themes of elder care, family dynamics, financial abuse, and the importance of self-advocacy in later life. It emphasizes that aging doesn't mean losing autonomy, that family love shouldn't come at the cost of dignity, and that it's never too late to reclaim control of your own life. The narrative highlights how proper legal and medical advocacy can protect vulnerable adults while preserving family relationships when possible.